She was already in the pre-op gown when I walked in, for in her arm, the OR scheduled in 40 minutes, and a room full of people who had collectively decided that her answer was yes. The donor advocate stood at the door with a clipboard she refused to hand over, and her eyes told me everything the paperwork never could. Sometimes the most dangerous thing inside a hospital isn't the disease, it's the silence of someone who has spent a lifetime forgetting how to say no. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, if someone you loved was dying, how far would you go? Hargrove Medical Center sits on the edge of Pittsburgh's south side like an old promise, wide corridors scrubbed clean. Walls lined with murals of recovery, and beneath all that institutional polish, the constant low hum of machines keeping people tethered to lives they're fighting to hold onto. I had been on shift since 5 in the morning, which meant the cold fluorescent light of the emergency room had already become part of my face, part of my posture, part of the particular heaviness that settles into your shoulders after enough hours of seeing people at their most undone. When the charge nurse from the transplant floor called down asking for a consult on a pre-op patient with elevated blood pressure, I almost handed it to one of the residents. Something made me take it myself. I've thought about that choice many times since, and I still can't name exactly what it was, only that something in the pit of my experience said to go. The transplant ward on the 4th floor was a different world from the chaos I lived in below. Quieter, intentional. Every movement up there carried the weight of a thing already decided. Nurses moving with choreographed purpose. Consent forms being triple-checked. Imaging being reviewed down the hall by a team that had done this 100 times and moved accordingly. The whole floor had its own gravity, pulling everything and everyone toward a single outcome. And on that particular Tuesday morning, that outcome had a name, a room number and a surgery time of 9:40. I rode the elevator up alone with my stethoscope around my neck and a cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the 2nd hour of my shift. The doors opened and I stepped into a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and something else. Something I've learned to recognize after 25 years on this side of medicine. Anticipation pressed so close to fear that the two had begun to blur into one another. Her name was Nadja Reeves, and she was 34 years old, and she had the kind of calm that requires an enormous amount of effort to maintain. I found her sitting upright on the edge of the hospital bed with a pre-op gown laid flat across her knees, hands folded in her lap with a stillness that was too deliberate to be natural. She smiled when I introduced myself, one of those smiles that arrives half a second too fast, rehearsed without knowing it's being rehearsed. The kind of smile you develop across years of being the person everyone else in the room needs you to be. Her blood pressure had spiked during the morning vitals, which was why I was there, and I went through the routine of listening and checking and noting. But what I was really paying attention to the whole time was her breathing, shallow and controlled, like someone carrying something very heavy and making absolutely certain not to let it show. I learned her story in fragments over the next 20 minutes, some from her chart and some from what she offered in that careful, measured way she had of speaking. Her brother Daniel was 28 and had been on dialysis for 2 years, 3 sessions a week. Every week, a ritual of tubes and machines, and borrowed time that had slowly reduced his world to the distance between his apartment and the dialysis center. Their mother had died when Daniel was 11 and Nadja was 17. She had raised him from there, worked nights at a diner, finished her own degree on scholarships and loans, and built herself into a school counselor who spent her professional days helping teenagers find the words for things they didn't know how to name, the cruelest kind of irony, as it turned out. She told me all of this without a single pause that suggested she found it heavy, which was, I now understand, its own kind of weight. It was when I stepped back into the hallway to update her chart that I first really noticed Dr. Carmen Vasquez standing near the nurse's station with a clipboard pressed flat against her chest, arms folded over it as though she was protecting something fragile underneath. Carmen was Hargrove's independent donor advocate her entire function, her entire reason for being in that building on that morning, was to be the one person in this process with no institutional stake in the surgery going forward. She was the firewall between protocol and personhood. Between the momentum of a decided machine and the quieter, messier question of whether the person inside that machine had chosen to be there. I had worked alongside her on 2 previous cases. I had never seen her look the way she looked standing in that hallway. The ward continued, moving around her with the confidence of a thing already in motion. The surgical team was reviewing imaging down the hall. The anesthesiologist had been in and out of Nadia's room twice. The ethics committee's approval had been filed 3 days prior, unanimous. Every criterion satisfied, every box checked, every protocol observed. And yet there stood Carmen Vasquez in the middle of all that institutional certainty, holding a clipboard she had not signed, looking at a closed door with the focused stillness of someone working through a problem that did not yet have a solution. I didn't know it then, but that unsigned form was about to pull the entire floor apart at the seams. Carmen requested a second private interview with Nadia at 8:15, which left exactly 85 minutes before the scheduled incision time. I knew because I was still on the floor. My blood pressure consult technically resolved. Nadia's numbers having stabilized after a small medication adjustment, and I hadn't left. I told myself it was because I wanted to ensure the readings held steady before clearing her, and that was partly true. The other part was something harder to justify clinically, something about this floor. This hallway and the woman with the unsigned clipboard had made leaving feel like the wrong thing to do. So I stayed. I found an empty chair near the nurse's station, poured what turned out to be the worst coffee of the morning, and I watched. The second interview happened behind a closed door in the small consultation room at the end of the hall. It lasted 31 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when Carmen went in, and I checked it again when she came out. What happened inside that room, I only learned afterward in pieces, from Carmen herself, and from the notes she eventually filed with unusual care. She had asked Nadia open-ended questions, the kind that don't come with right or wrong answers. The kind designed specifically to find the edge of what a person has already rehearsed saying. Open questions leave gaps. And it's in the gaps, in the hesitations and the overcareful words, and the places where the breath catches just slightly, that the truth tends to live. And somewhere, in those 31 minutes, the rehearsed version of Nadia Reeves had started to come apart at the seams. The crack appeared when Carmen asked a question she hadn't planned going in, won that. Arrived the way the most important questions often do, intuitively, from somewhere below professional training. She asked Nadia, if Daniel weren't your brother, if he were a stranger on this list, would you still be in that gown? The room had gone quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of certainty, not the quiet of someone thinking through an answer they already know. It was the fractured quiet of someone whose entire architecture of resolve had just been asked to hold a weight it was never specifically designed to bear. Nadia had taken a long time to answer, and the answer, when it finally arrived, had not been yes. Donde how in room 412. Daniel Reeves was waiting with the particular patience of someone who has learned to measure hope in small, careful doses. 2 years of dialysis had taken the kind of toll that doesn't always show up cleanly in a lab report. It shows up in the face, in the eyes, in the way a person stops making plans that extend beyond the near future. His aunt, Marlene, had been in the family lounge since 7 that morning. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s with a voice that carried through closed doors, even when she wasn't raising it. And she had hugged Nadia 3 times before pre-op. She had sighed. In 3 different constructions that all meant the same thing. You're the only one who can save him. She hadn't said it as pressure. She had said it as fact. As simple geography, Nadia was here. The answer was here. The solution and the sister occupied the same body, which was, perhaps, The most dangerous version of that sentence possible. Carmen walked out of the consultation room at 8:46 and went directly to the nurse's station. She set her clipboard down on the counter face up. And even from where I was sitting, I could see that the signature line at the bottom was still blank. She said it in a voice quiet enough that only I and the charge nurse caught the words. "I'm not clearing the donor. We need to pause this procedure." The charge nurse stared at her for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then she reached for the phone with the expression of someone who understood that what was about to happen would not be quiet. What followed in the next 4 minutes was the kind of controlled chaos that hospitals manage with practiced efficiency, a cascade of pages. Closed door, conversations that weren't quite closed enough. Voices dropping to urgent whispers that carried through the walls regardless. The surgical attending appeared in the hallway with the expression of a man whose precision schedule had just been interrupted. The transplant coordinator passed me twice, without eye contact, and somewhere behind the door of room 408, Nadia Reeves was sitting alone on the edge of a hospital bed. And I have wondered since whether she felt the shift, the exact moment when the institution that had been moving her steadily forward lurched, without warning, to a stop. The meeting convened in Sandra Klein's office at 9:03, with the operating room sitting 6 floors. Below, like a held breath, nobody dared to release Dr. Marcus Webb. The transplant surgeon arrived first and took the chair closest to the window with the quiet authority of a man whose entire professional life had been built around not wasting a single minute. The kind of surgeon who understands, at a cellular level, that time inside a hospital is not metaphorical but biological. Sandra Klein sat at the head of the table with a legal pad and the expression of someone already calculating the institutional exposure of whatever decision this room was about to produce. Carmen Vasquez placed her unsigned clipboard flat on the table in front of her. Face up, signature line visible to everyone, which I understood immediately was not an accident. It was a statement, clear and deliberate, made before a single word had been spoken. I was the last one called in, and I won't pretend I fully understood why. My clinical role in this case had been marginal by every formal standard. A blood pressure consult, resolved and documented, technically complete. I was an emergency medicine physician who had wandered into a transplant ethics standoff through a set of coincidences that didn't feel entirely coincidental anymore. Sandra introduced me as an objective clinical voice, and I accepted the description without pushing on it too hard. Though I suspected the real reason was simpler, I was the only attending who had sat beside Nadia that morning without an agenda attached, without a surgery to protect or a timeline to defend, and in a room full of people with something institutional at stake. That particular kind of neutrality had become temporarily valuable. Carmen presented her concerns with the meticulous restraint of someone who had done this before and understood that precision of language was the only weapon available to her in a room shaped by momentum. She described the behavioral indicators she had documented across both interviews, the over-controlled affect, the micro-hesitations embedded in otherwise fluent responses, the quality of the silence that followed the question about the hypothetical stranger, the way Nadia's breathing had changed in the final 10 minutes of their second conversation. She was deliberate about her word choices. Indicators rather than evidence, inconsistencies rather than coercion, concern rather than certainty. She was not claiming that Nadia was lying. She was claiming that Nadia had never been given the conditions necessary for her truth to feel safe enough to surface. Dr. Webb's response was measured but firm, the kind of firmness that comes not from cruelty, but from years spent standing at the intersection of hope and biology. He walked through the ethics committee process point by point, 3 independent interviews over 6 weeks, to psychological screenings, a full social work evaluation, every standardized, metric satisfying every established threshold. He reminded the room that Daniel Reeves had been on the transplant waiting list for 2 years, and that living donor transplants carried outcomes measurably superior to cadaveric alternatives. Outcomes that existed in peer-reviewed literature and not in the subjective impressions gathered during a 31-minute conversation conducted 80 minutes before surgery. His argument was not heartless. It was the argument of a man who had watched enough people die on waiting lists to understand that caution. Unchecked has its own body count. The room divided along lines that had less to do with medicine and more to do with how each person in that office had learned to trust themselves. Sandra Klein wanted a psychiatric consult. Doctor Priya Anand was already in the building and proposed a 2-hour delay while the evaluation was conducted, framing it as a compromise that protected the institution regardless of outcome. Webb accepted reluctantly, checking his watch with the careful expression of someone doing math. He didn't like the answers, too. Carmen said nothing in response to the compromise, which I read as neither agreement nor refusal, but as the silence of someone who understood that 2 hours was not the point. That the point was whether this institution had the courage to hear what a woman might say when the room finally stopped telling her what answer it needed. I was asked directly for my clinical opinion, and I gave it in the only honest form I had available to me. I said that in 25 years of emergency medicine, I had learned that the most dangerous moment in any resuscitation is not the crisis itself. It is the moment when everyone in the room has already decided what is going to happen next and stops listening for information that contradicts that decision. Nobody pushed back on that. Webb stared at the table. Sandra wrote something on her legal pad. Carmen looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone who had just been told they were not entirely alone in the room. The 2-hour delay was authorized at 9:17. Downstairs, the OR was notified, and somewhere on the 4th floor, in a gown she had put on before dawn, Nadia Reeves sat in the silence of a morning that was no longer moving toward the conclusion everyone had prepared her for. Dr. Priya Anand arrived on the 4th floor at 9:31 with the unhurried manner of a psychiatrist who understood that the speed of her entrance would set the emotional tone of everything that followed. She was a small woman with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she carried nothing into Nadia's room except a chair, which she pulled directly across from the bed and sat in without preamble, without a clipboard, without the architecture of formal evaluation visible in her hands. I watched from the hallway through the narrow window of the room's door, not because I had any clinical reason to, but because by that point I had become part of this story in a way that made walking away feel like a form of abandonment I wasn't prepared to commit to. What happened in that room over the next 90 minutes was something I can only describe in fragments, because I was only present for the beginning and the end of it, and because the most important parts of what occurred were not visible from a hallway window. What I know is that Priya did not begin with questions about the surgery or the donation or the ethics committee's criteria. She began, according to what she told me afterward, by asking Nadia about her job, about the teenagers she counseled, about what it felt like to sit with a young person in the middle of something they couldn't yet name, about what it required of a person to hold that kind of space for someone else day after day. She wanted Nadia to remember who she was before she became a solution to someone else's problem. At some point in the middle of that conversation, Priya didn't note the exact time, said it didn't matter. Nadia Reeves began to cry. Not the composed, apologetic kind of crying that people perform when they feel they are allowed to be briefly emotional before pulling themselves back together. The other kind. The kind that arrives when something that has been held for a very long time is finally, in the presence of someone who genuinely asks, allowed to put itself down. She told Priya about the night Daniel had called her from the dialysis center, voice barely above a whisper, saying he was so tired of the machine, tired of the waiting, tired of the shrinking radius of his own life. She told her that she had hung up the phone and sat in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store for 40 minutes and made a decision that had never entirely felt like a choice, but that had immediately begun to feel like her entire identity. When I was called back into the hallway at 11:05, Priya was standing outside the door with her glasses back on her nose and a look on her face that I recognized, the look of a clinician who has just witnessed something true and is now carrying the weight of what to do with it. She was direct with me, the way good psychiatrists are when the situation has passed the point where softening the language would serve anyone. She said that in her clinical judgment, Nadia's consent was not free. It was not coerced by threat or manipulation in any textbook sense. There had been no ultimatum, no cruelty, no single identifiable act of pressure. What had happened was quieter and, in many ways, far more difficult to name a lifetime of being the one who stayed, the one who stepped in, the one who made the hard thing easier for everyone else, had made the concept of refusal functionally unavailable to her. She did not know how to want something that came at a brother's expense, and she had stopped trying to know a long time ago. I carried that assessment down the hall to Sandra Klein's office myself, because I wanted to be the one to say it out loud. In a room that had spent the morning looking for a way to call Carmen's instinct invalid, I said it plainly. The psychiatric evaluation did not support proceeding with the donation as currently consented. And any surgery performed on this basis would not be surgery performed on a free person. Sandra was quiet for a long time. Webb, who was still in the room, took off his surgical cap and set it on the table in front of him. The momentum that had been building since, before dawn, the quiet machinery of protocol and scheduling and institutional certainty had just been asked to stop. And the room held the particular silence of people who are recalibrating everything they thought they were doing. The surgery was formally postponed at 11:22. I was the one who walked to Nadia's room to tell her. And I want to be precise about what I saw when I did. Not relief. Not grief. Not the clean resolution that stories are supposed to arrive at when the right decision is finally made. What I saw on her face was something far more complicated and far more honest. The expression of a person who had just been handed back a question she had never been allowed to ask herself, and who had absolutely no idea yet what the answer was going to be. The afternoon that followed the postponement had the particular quality of a place learning how to breathe again after something too big for it had passed through. The surgical team dispersed, with the practiced efficiency of professionals absorbing the redirection of a plan. The OR was reassigned, paperwork was amended in triplicate, and the institutional machinery that had been building toward a single point since the previous week began, slowly and without ceremony, to reconfigure itself around a new reality. I stayed on the floor longer than I needed to, which was becoming a habit I no longer bothered justifying to myself. The charge nurse brought me a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once, and I drank it standing at the window at the end of the hall, watching the packing lot below where a man in a heavy coat was sitting on a bench in the November cold, face turned up toward a sky that wasn't offering him anything particular in return. Daniel Reeves had been told at 11:40, and I was not in the room for that conversation. But I heard the silence that followed it, the particular absence of sound that travels through hospital walls when something irrevocable has just been said in a room nearby. What I learned later from the social worker who had been present was that he had not reacted the way anyone expected. He had not raged. He had not broken down. He had sat very still for a long time with his hands in his lap, and then he had said, quietly, that he had always been afraid this would hurt her, and that he had never known how to ask her not to do it. It was the most heartbreaking sentence I heard that entire day, because it meant that somewhere inside the machinery of family love and desperation and obligation, two people had been protecting each other from a conversation that might have changed everything, and neither of them had found the language in time. Marlene left the family lounge at 12:15 without speaking to anyone from the medical team, which I found out from the charge nurse who watched her go. I don't know what she understood about what had happened, or whether she allowed herself to understand any of it. There are people for whom the gap between love and harm is genuinely invisible, not because they are cruel, but because they have never been asked to look at it directly. And I have made my peace with the fact that not every story ends with the person at its edges arriving at a reckoning. The hospital is not a classroom. It does not guarantee that everyone present learns the same lesson from the same event. Carmen Vasquez filed her full advocate report at 1 in the afternoon with a thoroughness that I recognized as something beyond professional obligation. It was a document written for the record, yes, but also written for every future case where someone like her would stand in a hallway with an unsigned clipboard and need the institutional weight of a precedent behind them. I found her at the nurse's station afterward, entering her notes with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that the real work of advocacy was not the dramatic moment of refusal, but the quiet, meticulous documentation that made that refusal defensible to the next committee and the one after that. I told her she had done something important. She said she had done her job. The distinction clearly mattered to her, and I respected it enormously. Nadia was discharged that evening with a referral to an outpatient counseling program and a follow-up scheduled with Priya in 2 weeks. I saw her in the elevator on her way out. She was in her own clothes, a gray sweater and jeans, her hospital bracelet still on her wrist. And she was carrying a small canvas bag over one shoulder. She looked, for the first time that day, like a person rather than a patient, which is a distinction that sounds obvious but is, in practice, one of the most significant transformations I ever witnessed in this building. She stopped when she saw me, and she said thank you in the careful way of someone who hasn't yet entirely figured out what they're grateful for. I told her she had time, and I meant it in more ways than I said out loud. Daniel remained on the transplant list. His dialysis schedule continued. The future of his case was now genuinely open, which is both the hardest and the most honest thing I can say about it. No resolution wrapped in clarity, no tidy outcome dressed as closure. Just two people with a relationship that had been given back its complexity, its honesty, and its possibility in a single afternoon by a woman with a clipboard and the courage to leave her signature line blank. I walked out of Hargrove Medical Center at 6 that evening into a cold Pittsburgh dusk, and the weight of my stethoscope felt, just briefly, exactly like what it was. If this story made you stop and think, drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Nadia made the right call? Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I've spent 25 years in emergency medicine, which means I've spent 25 years watching people make decisions inside the worst hours of their lives. I've seen people sign consent forms with shaking hands and clear eyes. I've seen people say yes when they meant no. And I've seen them say no when yes was the only word anyone around them was willing to hear. What the Reeves case gave me, what I have carried in the quiet of every subsequent shift, in the space behind my eyes during the long stretches between patients, is a more precise and more demanding understanding of what it actually means to ask someone for something. Because asking, I now understand, is never neutral. Every request arrives inside a context, inside a history, inside a relationship with its own architecture of expectation and love and debt. And the person being asked is always bringing all of that into the room with them when they answer. Carmen Vasquez was right about something that the Ethics Committee, with all its thoroughness and rigor and good faith, was not designed to measure. The presence of coercion is not always a raised voice or a threat or a manipulative act you can document in a chart. Sometimes it is a lifetime of being the strong one. Sometimes it is 11 years of raising your brother after your mother is gone. Sometimes it is the accumulated weight of every moment someone has looked at you and found you reliable. And the way that wait, over time, makes you forget that reliability was always a choice you were free to revoke. That is not a failure of love. It is one of love's most painful distortions, the way it can, without meaning to, make someone invisible to the very people who care about them most. What I hope for, in the time that has passed since that November morning, is that Nadia Reeves eventually found her way back to the question Carmen asked her, the one about the stranger, and that the answer she arrived at, in her own time, in a room without a scheduled OR or a clipboard or a family in the waiting lounge, was finally completely hers. I hope Daniel is still fighting. I hope they are still talking. And I hope that somewhere in the conversation they are learning to have with each other, there is room now for the kind of honesty that only becomes possible when someone else has first made honesty safe. That is what Carmen gave them, not a refusal, not a complication, but the protected space for a truth to exist before it became a scar.